Hello, everyone. Bonjour, and welcome to Avalara's webinar on e-invoicing and e-reporting in France, the countdown to July the 1st, 2024. I'm Alex Baulf, Senior Director for Global Indirect Tax with Avalara, and I'm really pleased to be joined today with my colleague, live from Paris, Cyril Bray. Hi, Cyril.
Hi, Alex. Hello, everyone. I'm Cyril Bray. I'm Country Manager and Tax Director for Avalara in France and based in Paris. And we will talk to the invoicing and e-reporting for France today.
Thanks, Cyril. So in terms of the agenda for our presentation today, we're going to look at the journey so far. So the background to e-invoicing and e-reporting in France, in particular looking at the current B2G mandate. We're going to look at the timetable for this mandate and the legislative change. We're going to talk about what this means for French businesses from a practical perspective. We're going to look at the platforms that are available to issue, send, and receive e-invoices. And we're going to look at digital reporting and what that means. And then finally, we're going to look at the key takeaways for businesses. What are the real commercial considerations and what should businesses be doing now to plan for these upcoming changes? And then we're going to finish with a Q&A. So just to start, I just wanted to provide a very short bit of background about Avalara. We are a tax technology company founded in Seattle in the US, and we've been disrupting the status quo of global tax management since 2004. We have software and managed outsourced services for the entire indirect tax lifecycle, everything from VAT, GST registrations and returns across 86 different countries, all the way through to tax determination, the calculation of sales tax, VAT, GST at the point of sale, all the way through to the submission of VAT returns and digital reporting. And of course, that now includes e-invoicing following our acquisition of Imposia last year. Our headquarters in EMEA is Brighton in the UK, but we now have offices across Europe, including France, Germany, Spain, Belgium, Luxembourg, Romania, and Turkey. So the journey so far, while the mandate for B2B e-invoicing is brand new and hasn't kicked in yet, e-invoicing itself in France is not new. And the French government have actually been on its own journey in relation to e-invoicing over the last 4 or 5 years. Cyril, would you like to just provide a quick overview and the background to the B2G mandate?
Yes, for sure. Thanks, Alex. So yeah, coming back to the mandate for invoicing in France, in fact, it starts really since 2017. So in 2017, the French tax authorities has introduced a mandatory obligations for company who has to emit some invoices to a French government or to a public establishment, to do that via e-invoice and via a specific portal named Chorus Pro. In fact, it starts, so as I said, since 1st of January 2017 for large companies, and it's moved to until 2020 to micro companies. So yeah, in 3-4 years, all the company which needs to invoice French establishment, public one or governmental one, needs to use this portal. So the invoicing process, it's not a brand new one for 2024 mandate. It's clearly started in 2017.
Thanks, Cyril. So for B2G, French businesses currently use an existing national e-invoicing portal called Chorus Pro. So this is really a three-corner operating model where French businesses, the suppliers, can create, submit their invoices via a government portal or through invoicing software, ERPs, with a direct connection into that portal. And the customer, the government department, will then retrieve that invoice. And that's become part of day-to-day business life as part of public procurement with public contracts with government entities. I think one of the points we want to make here is there's a lot of flexibility with Chorus Pro. And even though it is e-invoicing, businesses can actually just do a manual entry of invoices direct on the platform. They can actually create an invoice by typing in the data on the screen, and can upload, download PDFs, XMLs, as well as using EDI. And that can be made, with a direct connection to Chorus Pro or via a third-party service operator. And Cyril, Chorus Pro has been seen as a bit of a success story. I know the number of users has grown. Can you talk over some of the stats that we've seen and some recent landmarks?
No, for sure. Yeah, it has been a real success story in France. As you clearly explained, the flexibility offered by Chorus Pro can be seen as, let's say, a first step into the invoicing world, because it has been clearly defined to permit to a different type of businesses to send via a specific portals without any additional cost, any invoice to be transformed in an invoicing. With the new mandate that we will see, it will be really different, but we will for sure deep dive later on. So regarding the stats themselves, we approximately have around 84 million of invoices exchanged on Chorus Pro right now, and we got approximately 1.4 million users of Chorus Pro. So it's clearly a real success, and I imagine that this success has been for sure the beginning of the new mandate for the French authorities.
That's interesting, Cyril. And I wonder how long it will take for that 84 million to be beaten, under the B2B mandate. Maybe literally a matter of days or weeks.
Yeah, for sure.
And look, unlike some European countries who have started with a B2G mandate, like Italy, who had the SDI platform for B2G, France isn't actually scaling that platform for B2B. So we're going to talk about it later, but there is going to be a brand new platform for e-invoicing in France, and it's not merely scaling the Chorus Pro.
Oh, correct. There is no extension of the Chorus Pro, but kind reminder for, let's say, all participants that Chorus Pro for sure should stay alive and needs to be used for, it's mandatory to use for emissions of invoices to French authorities or French, let's say, public establishments.
Great. Thanks, Cyril. So we're now going to look at the timeline for e-invoicing and e-reporting. We've just looked at the origins, looking at B2G, but for B2B, really this was confirmed in September 2021 last year with legislation in the form of an ordinance coming out confirming the introduction of this mandate. The French government have issued guidance, frequently asked questions, as well as draft technical specifications, and they've been engaging with various industry bodies, e-invoicing forums, and service providers like Avalara. The most recent FAQs were released at the end of May, and we've just received the final specifications. Hopefully these are near complete. Prior to the end of June, the only specs that were available were about 70% complete, so still some gaps. And of course, we're now working through all of the detail, just so we have clear requirements for the mandate. So looking ahead, next year, 2023, this will be a time for partner platforms to start onboarding with the French authorities. But in terms of businesses, probably a time to start vendor selection and implementation, considering things like training, as well as general awareness for the business. Because as we're going to talk about, this is a big change for business as usual, a big change to traditional financial and procurement processes. There is a pilot which is going to start from the 1st of January 2024. So that will involve a limited number of e-invoicing operators, the PDP platforms, and some pilot customers who will start to issue and receive e-invoices. But then the full mandate will kick in from the 1st of July 2024. And from this date, the initial tranche of large businesses must all be able to issue e-invoices and issue e-invoices to business customers. But actually from this very same date, all businesses in France, so approximately 4 million, will need to be in a position to receive e-invoices. And of course, for every invoice that's issued by a supplier, by a vendor, there will be a customer, and they will vary in size. So I think a really key point there that, every single business in France really needs to be prepared for this mandate and have the relevant software and processes in place by the 1st of July 2024. So there's going to be a phased introduction. I mentioned the July 1st date in 2024 for large companies to issue e-invoices, and also when they need to start e-reporting data. But then there is a staggered introduction for other businesses in France. Cyril, can you give a bit of an overview of that, please?
Oh, yes, for sure, Alex. So yeah, as you said, I think a key point is to remind that as from July 1st, 2024, all businesses needs to receive invoicing. So that means that you should be ready to receive any invoices from your suppliers for services and for goods. There is no exception for that. So that's really an important point. For the other ones, emissions of invoices and e-reportings, there is, as Alex, you said, a phase introduction. This phase will start from July 1st for large companies. So it will be a very limited number of companies which will be within the scope of this first phase. And as per July 1st, the large company will have to issue invoices and to submit e-reportings to all their clients and to tax authorities for e-reportings. Second step should be January 1st, 2025. So small and medium-sized companies will have to issue invoices and submit e-reportings. And the last one should start on January 1st, 2026 with small and very small companies, which will have also to issue invoices and submit e-reportings. So in fact, that should be a sort of gradations from July 1st, 2024 to January 1st, 2026. It's around 1.5 years to apply for all type of businesses, the invoicing and e-reportings. But again, and sorry to potentially read what I have said before, but it's really important to know that you should be ready to receive invoices in July 1st, 2024. So it's now less than 2 years.
Thanks, Cyril. And that is quite an ambitious timeframe. So 2 years to go until large businesses have to raise e-invoices, and all businesses in France need to receive them. And of course, smaller, medium-sized businesses, don't have to wait, to that relevant date in 2025 or 2026. They can, of course, join e-invoicing in the revolution, much earlier. So, why is France introducing e-invoicing and e-reporting? Well, it really is the clear direction of travel. There are, a vast number of countries in Europe and beyond introducing e-invoicing. Interestingly, the EU Commission is also looking at e-invoicing as part of its VAT in the Digital Age initiative, looking to try and encourage the use of e-invoicing to reduce costs, find efficiencies for SMBs, but also potentially looking at trying to harmonize standards. And it's also this idea of simplification that, why the French are introducing e-invoicing. As part of their communication with businesses, they said, one of the real drivers of this is to simplify doing business in France. I know that's a bit of a surprise, when there's a genuine compliance mandate coming in, and that's going to require time, effort, and investment. But ultimately, the benefits that businesses should derive, from e-invoicing should simplify, the business process in terms of procurement, but also the AR process too, and getting paid quicker. But there's also, a very large finance transformation piece here. The government's looking, to drag France, into the digital age, and e-invoicing is seen as an area which can really transform the finance function, really improve processes. And, there's been a figure of 4.5 billion euros mentioned as the estimated saving as a result of implementing this mandate. And very interesting, this this stat that the French have published. Based on research, it costs around 10 euros on average to issue, send, post, process a paper invoice. But the move to digital and move to an e-invoice will cost less than a postage stamp. And Cyril, some of the goals of the French tax authority, really focus on the VAT gap, which is of course a pan-European problem, and every European tax authority is looking to address. Can you shed a bit of light on that? Why the French are introducing e-invoicing, and maybe some of the benefits we might see in terms of VAT compliance for French businesses?
No, yeah, for sure. So in addition, what you explained before regarding the real, let's say, move to the digital era, and also to the fact that, company may have an opportunity to simplify and to have some cost savings with the use of invoices instead of sending, for sure, paper invoices. I would say that there is three main areas why French authority has introduced invoicing and e-reporting. First one, it's linked to an ultimate goal that it's to simplify the VAT reporting obligations. We will have to rely on transactional data, and then we can, at the end, pre-populate a VAT return already pre-filed with transaction data. That's clearly the goal that the tax authority wants to reach. And when you combine invoicing, obligation, a full automatic pre-filed VAT return in France. So I think, next step in the next coming year for me, for sure, to have these compilations. Second interesting point is that, as you said, Alex, there is an important VAT fraud in Europe, not only in France, to be honest. We are talking about multiple billion euros of VAT frauds. So one estimated, I think, in year 2019, 2020, it's around 14 billion euros of VAT not collected in France. So it's represents more than 7.4% of total VAT collected. So it's really huge. And with this type of approach, tax authority will have all transactions and can potentially, let's say, focus on the right persons that do not declare or do not, let's say, collect the VAT at the right moment. So in terms also of tax audits, they can potentially use more efficiently their resource and focus on the, let's say, bad guys. And last point is that we are moving to a sort of real-time knowledge company and society. So for sure, there should be an interesting and important point that we need to have a real-time knowledge from a company point of view and also from a tax authority point of view. So getting all the invoices data plus e-reporting will permit tax authority to have a real-time view of the transactions. And again, they can focus on certain areas they want to. So it should be a real, let's say, move to the next century from a tax authority point of view.
Thanks, Cyril. And you can tell we are recording this live because it wouldn't be a recording from Paris without the sign of French sirens in the background. Completely agree. And what we're seeing there is a global trend. We're seeing tax authorities look to digitalize their own processes. The tax authorities are getting more data savvy. They're now able to receive more data. And once they receive that, they're going to run data analytics, exception reports, even in the future, machine learning and AI. So all of this data the French are going to obtain from B2B through e-invoices for cross-border and B2C through digital reporting, and then import VAT through the new reverse charge. So import declarations from the 1st of January have to have the importer's French VAT number, and then the French will actually pre-populate in that import VAT reverse charge in the return. So getting data from different and diverse sources, but then, bringing that together to prepare the returns. And I also completely agree, audits will be more targeted. This idea of e-invoicing has CTC continuous transaction controls. So the French government is able to run checks on the invoice data in real time. So, no longer just looking at a sample of data, but looking at every single transaction a business undertakes. And it can, spot errors, discrepancies, possible fraud, and then really focus its time, its resources, its people, following, where the tax is. So we're now going to look at, what do we mean by e-invoicing and e-reporting in France? Well, e-invoicing is the issuing, transmission, and receipt of e-invoices in a mandated format, which is a structured format, including a minimum base of data. And under this mandate, all French companies will be required to issue e-invoices to other French business customers. So this is limited to B2B. This is limited to domestic invoicing. So this specifically excludes non-resident French VAT-registered businesses. It specifically excludes invoicing customers who are based outside of France. And it specifically excludes invoices or receipts to private consumers, B2C, in France. But while there's no requirements for French companies to physically issue an e-invoice to a private consumer, B2C sales will be covered by the e-reporting requirements. So there'll still be a minimum data set that needs to be reported periodically to the French tax authority via the same e-invoicing platform. And so e-reporting is the transmission to the French tax administration of mandated data relating to transactions not specifically covered by the e-invoicing mandate. So looking at e-reporting, what's in scope? Well, it includes international B2B supplies, both sales and purchases, including intra-community dispatches of goods and supplies of services, exports of goods and services to customers outside of the EU, intra-community acquisitions of goods and services, as well as the import of goods and services from outside the EU. So a very large, wide base of transactions. So, even if you're not physically required to raise an e-invoice to the customer, the French tax administration is still getting that invoice data just through the e-reporting mandate. This also includes B2C supplies too, so supplies of goods and services rendered in France. This also includes the distant selling of goods to France and also into France, as well as the sale of goods and services to non-EU private consumers. So, for example, maybe the provision of digital services to consumers outside of France. And Cyril, this isn't limited to French companies. While e-invoicing is very focused in its scope for French businesses, e-reporting is much wider than that. So, can you talk to us about that, and also, why it's required to submit payment data, and what the scope of that is as well?
Oh yeah, for sure. So as you explained, yes, the scope of e-reporting, it's clearly, let's say, wider in terms of taxable operation scope versus the invoicing one. But it's also linked to the fact that multiple companies have, let's say, transactions which are taxable in France, but they are not based in France. So for a company which is not, let's say, based in France from a registration point of view, but only got, for example, a VAT registrations, they will need to submit the e-reporting for their transactions that you list, Alex, except in one case if they use OS or iOS regime, because in that cases, in fact, all their transactions have already been reported from their own member states to all authorities, including France. So France can directly have access to their transactions. They don't need to, for sure, request it again. So that's the only, let's say, exceptions to the rule. Regarding payment data, so just clarify that payment data are only requested for services transactions, not for goods sales transactions, for sure. And we need to transmit to tax authority two important informations. First one is the payment date, when payment has been, let's say, received and paid by the buyer to the suppliers. And the other one is the payment amount, which needs to be for sure in local currency, so in euros, and needs to clearly indicate what is the taxable basis for the VAT. So those two transactions are really important for services, because for France, we have a different, let's say, trigger events to collect and deduce the VAT applied for services. So normally it's when the services it's delivered and paid. So in fact, if you don't pay, you don't have the right to deduce the VAT, and in the opposite side, your provider is not obliged to collect the VAT. There is one potential option regime called TVA sur les débits that we use in France, in fact, and this regime permits to move all your services and align them with the same trigger event as goods for deduction and collection of VAT.
Thanks, Cyril. Yeah, very, very interesting. And again, I see this as a wider trend. As countries introduce any invoicing mandate, they're also interested in obtaining the data for supplies not covered by invoicing. So we've recently seen something very similar in Italy, where their e-invoicing mandate via the SDI has been extended to include e-reporting of cross-border sales and purchases. So we're now going to look at platforms, how businesses will actually send and receive e-invoices in France under the new rules. Well, there are a couple of options here. Businesses can send e-invoices via an approved third-party commercial partner platform. In France, this is known as a partner dematerialization partner, or PDP. In effect, these are e-invoicing suppliers and the software they provide that will connect into the Portail Public de Facturation. Cyril will correct me on that pronunciation in a minute, but the PDP will connect into that main government portal. As an alternative, it's possible to connect directly into that portal without using a third party. If you use a PDP, a third party platform, they do need to be authorized by the French tax authority, and there is a formal approval process with an audit process as well. That process has started. Avalara is a member of a working group and working alongside the French tax administration as part of this rollout. And if you have a provider who is able to submit the data, maybe for example through an EDI connection, but they're not authorized, so they fail to make the approved list, they can't actually act as a PDP. So what does that mean? Well, it means they can only submit data. So they, in effect, become an intermediary just to pass the data through to the main French platform. One point just to add is, people are thinking, why would I invest in a third-party platform, a PDP, if I can connect direct? Well, the French government have said, there's quite basic limited functionality within the main platform. It's really been designed, for much smaller businesses. The example we were given at the French e-invoicing day was actually just a boulangerie, a French baker. Very small businesses, not issuing that many e-invoices and certainly not receiving that many either. Whereas the PDPs themselves will have much greater functionality, which will also allow you to scale across different countries too. So the e-invoicing process, what does it look like? What is the change going to be, using these platforms? Well, French businesses will no longer send invoices direct to customers, and they will now go direct from a partner platform or the public invoicing portal to the customer's platform. And again, the customer may be using a PDP, or they may be using the public portal themselves direct. The choice of the platform is completely up to the French business. It is a commercial choice and decision. And in fact, your customer may be using the same platform as you. They may be using a different one. They may be plugged into the public billing portal direct themselves. But as I said before, we are expecting more limited functionality. So, as you start to look at your business requirements, your tax requirements, for the new e-invoicing regime, do look at, what functionality you see as a must-have. Do consider things like archiving. There are very strict rules, in France and across Europe in terms of how and where that data can be stored.
And I think, Alex, on top of that, to be honest, it's really important, as you explained, that to remind to businesses that the real tax and legal invoices, which should serve for the collection or deductions of VAT in France, will now become the invoice. So if for any reasons you want to continue to send also a sort of PDF or other forms to your potential customers, it should not be considered as a real invoices. So clearly the new process is that you will have the obligations to emit the invoice, and it should go via a PDP and after a PPF. And then it's up to your customer to receive it from the PPF or to use their own PPP. But yeah, as you said, PPF has much more also been created to permit to smallest businesses to do not have a real huge cost with the providers just to manage their invoice obligations. But yeah, for let's say medium size or large company, for sure, the potential options offered by the PPF are quite limited.
Thanks, Cyril. And that thing you just said about wanting to send an invoice in parallel to the customer. The real driver here is to look for one process. We're aligning tax reporting, with the normal invoicing process. This is not meant to be a parallel process like in some countries. It's not just a parallel reporting process like in Hungary, like in Spain. It really is meant to be the tax invoice is issued to the customer in an electronic format via the government platform. But the key question that I think we're going to jump into right now is what format does that need to be? Because having something that's human readable is going to be key. Because someone has to view this, approve it, post it, normal traditional business processes. So under the e-invoicing mandate in France, there are multiple acceptable formats for e-invoicing. So there is a degree of choice and flexibility for suppliers and customers. All PDPs, so the partner platforms, will need to offer a minimum number of common formats to guarantee the interoperability of e-invoicing. And it's actually going to be the customer who will inform its supplier what format of the e-invoice they want to receive. E-invoices can be created in a structured or mixed format in one of three base formats, compatible with the EN 16931 standard, which is actually the EU's own e-invoicing standard and has been used for public procurement and under the existing B2G regimes. The three formats are UBL, CII, or FactorX. And it's FactorX that I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about, because the latest version of FactorX has recently been released. And this is actually a joint initiative between France and Germany. So it's an invoice that is interoperable across both France and Germany, so particularly used in public procurement, but also e-invoicing between businesses, in these countries. And to go back to a key point we said before, under the new mandate, businesses can't simply scan a paper invoice. They can't simply just create a standard PDF, send that out as an attachment on email. That's just not allowed anymore. It doesn't meet the technical requirements of the new law. But what does FactorX do? Well, FactorX is a hybrid document that combines both a more traditional human-readable PDF, but with embedded XML language, which can be read by a machine. So as I said, this has been a standard that's been developed in cooperation with Germany. And it's my personal view that I think this will be a very popular format, probably the most preferred format of the three. It's probably as close to today's business as usual as you can get, because it can still be easily read by a person. So I think it's very business friendly. If someone's processing this in France in a shared service center, offshore, they can still clearly read the invoice. Unlike some formats, where you sometimes feel you need a degree in computer programming language to actually read the master and transactional data. But that is a key point, and under both European e-invoicing law and under the new law, if the customer requests a human readable, legible version of the e-invoice, the PDF platform has to be able to create that and provide it to the customer. But of course, with this FactorX, you actually have that from day one because it's human readable and machine readable all in one. So what data will ultimately be shared with the French tax authority? Well, in the technical specifications, there are 24 mandatory items of data to be sent. I'm not going to walk through every single one here, but Cyril, it's quite obvious here that the vast majority of things here are what you'd expect to see on a French tax invoice already. They're required, they're mandated under law. But I think the interesting thing here is, everything you see here, there will be an agreed format or taxonomy, so the French tax authority can really understand the data. They can validate the invoice. They can also run analytics.
Yeah, just an important point, I think, Alex, it's as it's clearly, let's say, described on the slide, and as you explained, you've got 24 mandatory items to be present and the data to be sent. But for sure, most of the company have a huge more number of items present on their invoice. So it's clearly a voluntary limitations to collect some informations which are relevant for, let's say, VAT side, because, for example, we are not specifically collecting information about any specific internal reference of the goods, so anything that it's clearly, let's say, intuitive personnel to the company. So yeah, it's clearly information which are only needed from a tax point of view to manage and ensure that we can have some checks on the VAT collect or deduce on the invoice.
Perfect. And the SOREN number, is that common? Is that data that most businesses should hold about its customers already?
Yeah, normally as serial number, it's really important ones, and most of the businesses are using one. So yeah, it's again, I assume that potentially PDP platform may generate also between each other some sort of internal specifications to ensure that if someone uses, for example, a mandatory information which is not requested by tax authorities, that it should be also readable from the opposite platform they may use. Because in fact, yes, the real, let's say, challenge here is that you need to have interoperability between platforms. So then we need to have a referential, a shared one, which is acceptable by all platforms.
I completely agree. And that's a very important point. So, of course, you have the mandatory, very tax sensitive e-invoicing data and these data elements that need to be shared. But, care also has to be taken on the additional commercial information that you may have on an invoice. So, you still want that shared with the customer. So we need to make sure, that's recorded in the right field, and that's shared and can be received by the customer. So ultimately, what does this mean for French businesses? Well, really it's one big business process change. How a business issues, receives, and ultimately interacts with its trading partners will change. So under the new rules, you can no longer print, send, email, paper, scanned, standard PDFs. All invoices must be e-invoices in a structured format, meeting those local requirements. The invoices need to be sent a partner platform, a PDP, or direct via the public invoicing portal. Businesses in France, if they are going to use a partner, a platform, they need to select and implement one that's compliant. And as I said before, they need to be approved. And then there is a very large people, process, technology and data angle to this. It's going to impact multiple departments and completely change business as usual finance, accounting, sales, and procurement processes. And that's going to lead to a lot of change in management. So, really advising, businesses to start planning now, really identify, who are the key stakeholders in the business now that need to be involved, because, processes are going to have to be refined. They will change, and you need to find a way of, meeting the requirements, meeting the legislation, but also carrying out business, how you carry out business, how you need to interact with your suppliers, with your customers. So we're obviously talking about France today, and that's the focus, the 2024 changes. But is this just a French issue? It's not. We're seeing a critical mass of e-invoicing mandates being announced across the EU. It's almost every single week there seems to be another country that introduces a mandate. So, for everyone, listening in, watching this webinar, I'd say, don't just think of e-invoicing as a local French requirement to meet, not just a tick in the box, a tactical approach to this issue, but think of the wider global issue around e-invoicing. Consider scalability, interoperability across the different countries. Now is the opportunity to actually invest in a single scalable e-invoicing solution and platform. Really now is the time to create a genuine strategy. What is your business? What is your group's approach to e-invoicing? I think gone are the days where it's just seen as a local issue, where you may license a bit of local software from a local provider, just to tick a box. This is going to become a business as usual issue. So if you're going to make the technology investment, really consider, can that be scaled across different processes? Can it be scaled across different territories? And actually on the slide here, I think we've got a few examples of some mandates. So Poland, has recently been announced this is likely to be pushed back now to January 2024. So their KSEF platform will make e-invoicing mandatory for B2B. That will come in likely 6 months ahead of France. Spain is looking to introduce B2B e-invoicing too. Again, likely up to 6 months before France. Belgium, probably looking at a similar time frame. They're introducing B2G e-invoicing, but they're likely to scale that to business very quickly after that, and probably using the PEPL network, which is a network built on European public procurement, guaranteeing interoperability between different countries. And then, there are a number of countries across Central and Eastern Europe who are also introducing e-invoicing, either proposing it, they've got a pilot program, bring it in for B2G, or very quickly introducing it then for B2B. So, lots of countries to watch. But I think my point here is it's not just a French issue. E-invoicing is now a pan-European, if not a global trend. And it's something businesses should really look at strategically. So what are the key takeaways? A bit of a summary of the requirements and what businesses need to do. Cyril, I'll let you start here.
Sure. So I think, as you said, what you want to, let's say, potentially keep from this webinar is that, July 2024, it's a starting date in France. Just note it in your calendar. I think from this date, you will be in a position to accept any invoices you will receive from any supplier in France. It's also the starting date for large company to emit invoices to businesses. So again, you may be not a large company, but you will be in a position to at least receive invoices from large company. What we have seen also is that, and based on also my previous experience working for industries, I can say that, starting up an IT process to request investment and develop solutions take between 6 to 18 months. So if you do a retro planning starting from July 1st, 2024, you will see that it's now time to take decisions to validate your budget and to think about the future, because you will be engaged before the end of the year for the next 18 months. So it's really important that you start thinking about the, let's say, new requirement as per now, and don't wait too long. And again, more longer you will wait, more potentially difficult time you will have to find the right providers and to have time to work together, because it should be clearly also a new area for the providers. So for sure, many providers are actually providing EDI or invoicing services, but most of them will have to jump on the new specifications, will have to work with the tax authorities, and that's why it will be a pilot phase beginning of 2024. And again, it's clearly in the agenda that tax authority don't want to delay another time the implementation of the invoices.
Thanks, Cyril. We know that really makes sense to me. And just that number of businesses in France that are affected by this, close to 4 million, that's going to put a lot of pressure, on IT departments, on third-party vendors, on forming implementation teams, with quite an ambitious time frame. So, I think the businesses that invest the time and effort now up front, really identifying their own, processes, identifying what systems are involved in their current e-invoicing process. Do they have deviations based on, specific customers? Do they have vendors that deal with them in different ways? Now is the time to really start blueprinting that, understanding what your current process is, identifying, where the change is going to be, and then having, really clear requirements. So, when you go out to the market and you speak, to PDPs, to the e-invoicing software providers, you can have good, meaningful conversations and hopefully, then move to, implementation, sooner rather than later. Planning is going to be really key. So I just wanted to summarize some kind of real commercial considerations. What kind of planning activities should businesses be doing now? Well, first of all, start forming cross-functional project teams and create a project plan. Really identify the relevant stakeholders across the business. Certainly IT, procurement, sales. Everyone involved in the invoicing process. So tax and accounting are going to be key here as well. But do consider the customer experience too. Don't forget the people side of this as well. People are going to be involved, in raising invoices, receiving them, posting them. Do you use shared service centers? Do you have third parties involved? That's something you need to understand now, because it's going to be key to not only implementing a compliant e-invoicing solution, but also implementing the new process and documentation going forward. As I said before, France isn't doing this alone. Other countries are implementing e-invoicing, but others have done it in the past. So, try and learn lessons from experiences of doing this in other countries. If you've got a presence in Italy, for example, is there anything from the implementation there over the last few years, which you can learn from. What went well, what went, I'll say wrong, or what could have gone better. Also use this as a chance to actually create a roadmap for all the invoicing mandates. Are there synergies there? Can you develop a strategy? Can you procure an e-invoicing solution that meets more than one of these mandates? So you're not going to duplicate time and effort later on. Really get this on the agenda of the IT team early. You really want to make them aware of the changes, get their support, get their buy-in really early. And then in terms of kind of leadership, the C-suite of the business, again, it's early awareness. Really make them aware of the importance of this change, the legislation, the mandate, but also, you're going to have to start getting budget approved. So if procurement and implementation, is likely to start next year in 2023, that budget is going to have to be approved at the end of this year. And we know budget approval is often a process that takes, weeks or even months. So, now is the time to start building up that budget, factoring in costs, but also factoring in time and effort, resource. Who's going to be on that project team? Who's going to be leading it? To what extent is the business going to need to be involved in the implementation? And to what extent are you going to use third parties to help implement and test? And then, be aware of the full implementation lifecycle. I'm sure, a lot of businesses will have gone through an implementation of an ERP software, maybe even e-invoicing in a different country. But, the standard phases, kind of awareness and discovery, everyone watching this, hopefully that's part of your discovery, starting to, build up your knowledge. As I said before, identify all the different billing systems and platforms, ERPs, that may need to issue e-invoices. It's likely that PDPs will need direct integrations into all of those different systems. Start defining the requirements. Interpret the legislation. What are the key requirements that you need to meet in your new software, in your new process? Procurement. Don't underestimate the procurement cycle. You may need to take this to RFP. At the very least, you may need to start shortlisting vendors to go and speak with. The implementation, again, that will need project management. Do speak to the PDP provider or the professional services firm that's going to implement the solution. How long realistically that's going to take. Do factor in time for testing. Do factor in time to document this. Having your own documentation, user training. This is going to be brand new for all of your people. If people are involved in invoicing offshore in a shared service center, in a center of excellence, again, they will need training. They will need updated process notes and manuals. And then finally, go live. Hopefully that will go smooth. But a point I often make in these big transformation projects is, your customers, your suppliers, you're all in this together. It's in everyone's interest for, there to be really clear communication and to help each other. Because, you need a compliant e-invoice for you to be able to recover the VAT. And likewise, you need to raise a compliant invoice to be paid, by your customer. So finally, I just wanted to provide a bit more background on Avalara and our role within e-invoicing, and in particular in France. As I mentioned earlier, we acquired Imposia, a well-established e-invoicing company, last year. So Imposia by Avalara has been an existing EDI and e-invoicing provider in France since 2015, and has various customers involved in the B2G mandate e-invoicing via Chorus Pro. And we're also a member of the French e-invoicing working group for PDPs. So working closely to understand and digest the requirements, as well as being approved to be a PDP in France. We're also a member of Le Forum National de la Facture Électronique, the FNFE. That is the key forum for e-invoicing. Has been involved very closely in the development of these new rules. We attend regular meetings, webinars as a member. And we recently attended their E-invoicing day in Paris. And then Avalara is a member of ESPA, the European E-invoicing Service Providers Association. So, again, getting some really good insights and intelligence, through that industry body. We're a certified PEPL service provider, but also, we do provide the entire indirect tax compliance lifecycle in France. So we already prepare VAT returns, and we're a fiscal representative in France, and we already have a French presence. So Cyril is our local French country manager, and we have a local team and people in country. So that actually wraps up the main presentation. So we're now going to move to Q&A and see if there's any questions lined up for us. Okay, so some questions. Cyril, I'm going to direct this at you if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Can I continue to send invoices to customer via email and an e-invoice to the tax authority?
So unfortunately, the answer is not. You can't, because in fact, as we try to explain, and I hope it was clear, but I will potentially, let's say, read it. What we said is that, the real invoices is to be sent via tax authority via the PDP or the PPF. So there is no possibility to continue sending like before the invoices and only, let's say, send in parallel information to tax authorities. That's not possible anymore.
Thank you. Another question. I'm technically an SME and have additional time to prepare for the changes. Does that mean I don't have to do anything now?
Good questions. I think if you focus on the emission side, you will have for sure, as you said, a little bit more time to be ready to emit invoices. But in parallel, keep in mind, and I try to remind it a lot of time during the webinar, that as per July 1st, you will have to receive the invoices. So to be honest, I would recommend for SMEs and for all companies, as we try also to focus on, to start now working on the new mandate. And then for sure, they may have additional times to be ready or to do some fine tuning at the end. But yeah, it's really, let's say, a go live to be done in the next, let's say, couple of months and not in 2 years. So yeah, it's better to start working on the mandate right now.
Great. Thanks, Cyril. I completely agree with all of that. Do I have to use an approved PDP?
It's not mandatory to use an approved PDP. I think we explained the different way of sending invoices to customers. So you have, let's say, two main ways. The first one is to use directly the PPF, which is the public portals. So you don't have to use a PDP for that. And the second possibility is to use an agreed PDP to send directly the invoice to your customers. So as we explained, the main difference between agreed PDP and PPF is the functionality that we could have behind, let's say, the only transmission services of the data. So for sure, a PDP can work with their clients to, for example, prepare some specific dashboard reports, to have access to, I don't know, potential payment periodicity and pay invoices. So there is, I assume, a lot of possibility to work on the sort of blockchain transactions data we may collect that are not for sure possible with the PPF, which is more simplified portals set up for smallest businesses.
Great, no, thank you. So question here, will the French tax authority check the correct VAT treatment on the invoice? That's an interesting question.
That's a good one. To be honest, the idea it's not a sort of real-time checkers, but it's clearly to have access at the transactions data. Then tax authority can process in the second stage all the transactions data and then potentially highlight some errors in the VAT treatments. With e-reportings, it's become more tricky, let's say, because we will have a sort of potential direct analyze of the data. So I assume the final aim of invoicing and e-reporting for tax authority point of view is to be able to do a sort of live validation of invoices, but due to the volumes, due to the complexity of sometimes the calculations and the information analysis, I'm not sure they should be in a position to do that before a few more years.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think as we move closer, to the go live, I think we'll have more detail in terms of the actual controls that the French tax authority, will put in place. We do know, in effect, the portal will approve the invoice. So the data, the e-invoice that's submitted, will have to meet various checks. That's probably initially more on the contents, but as you said, they're going to have the data to actually do a tax determination decision. So, if we're reporting a zero tax, but it's a domestic transaction, I'm sure that's something that can be easily spotted. And that's a growing trend. I mentioned the Polish KSEF e-invoicing platform. The Polish tax authority have said, they are going to introduce a VAT check. So maybe that's something to consider. When you're implementing your e-invoicing solution, how confident are you in both your data, the master data that you're using, as the basis to calculate VAT, but also that actual decision. I think with e-invoicing, you should be getting the tax right first time, and there's always the chance that it's going to be rejected if it's wrong. And certainly the French tax authorities will have more visibility. So, rather than looking at a sample of data or just aggregated data in a VAT return, under this new mandate, the tax authority see every single transaction. They have that data. They can run their analytics, their exception reporting, to try and spot errors or irregularities.
No, for sure.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's the final question. Some really great ones. Thank you, Cyril. I've really enjoyed today. I hope everyone watching this has too. Please, do feel free to reach out to us. Our email addresses are on the screen. Do continue to read our blogs. We'll be providing updates, as and when there are updates from the French Tax Authority, any updates to technical specifications, any kind of insights, thought leadership that we provide on e-invoicing in general. So with that, I wish everyone a good rest of the day, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Merci.
Merci.